some about your folks and them.
Well, it'd be
How would-
better to start with when your grandparents came,
Okay.
great-granddad came here.
Okay, we'll roughly go through that, but
That's-
they can pick up other things.
I'm going to be real picky here. One,
Go ahead, Shirley.
We're Dick and Shirley Jameson. We met out east of Walsenburg on January 6th, 1957, and got married the next December. We've lived at Cachera all the time, except for a year and a half in La Vida. We travel to Arizona and New Mexico in the wintertime and do a lot of history research and so on while we're gone to other states. It's amazing how much the history here is just about the same as it is, and the same people as in New Mexico and Arizona.
Tombstone had a lot of Colorado people.
Oh, wow.
All right. I guess what we'll go to next is my family on my mother's side came here in 1896 to the Yellow Pine Ranch, the part where Joanne Van Loo lives now was the part they bought then from Bushmill, I think it was. But anyhow, it was my great-granddad and 5 sons
So,
and 1 daughter and her son that moved here. Later, they put in a sawmill right where the old garden is, or where the old garden used to be below Joanne's house was a sawmill powered by one of the old steam tractors. Someplace there was a picture I saw of it, but that was a long time ago. And the barns at the Yellow Pine were built by the Powell brothers. Now, they all got to working on the railroad quite a bit to make extra money. And my granddad was working on the now Levita Pass Railroad, standard gauge. When they were putting it in, he was helping build one of the trestles across the canyon. He had met my grandmother in Cimarron River Canyon in north of Boise City, Oklahoma, when she was a little girl. According to her story, they tried to have a date, but never could. But anyhow, her mother was doing voicing for my grandfather that was cowboying there, and his brother that was school teaching there. And I can't think of
Boise City.
Yeah, it wasn't really Boise
Well,
City.
Garrett, Oklahoma
Garrett,
is
Oklahoma.
the town that, and
But
Grandma
anyhow,
Powell's sister later married one of the Garretts.
later on, as they said, he moved up here and he was working on the railroad. Getting awful lonesome living up there in a tent. He sent my grandmother a letter and some money and said, get on the train and come to Walsenburg and I will meet you and I will marry you. And she came. Never had a date,
She was 18 and he was 30.
but they got married down just west of the high school, across the street, in a little house that's still there. That's where they got married. They worked up here that summer, then they went back down to eastern Colorado in the Cimarron country, and he cowboyed down there some more. Till my uncle, Lloyd Powell, was 4, I think, when they moved up here,
Probably.
and Mom was just a baby when they moved back to Cachera, and bought out the south half of the Yellow Pine, which was owned by Charlie Mack. It's an old-time name that we can go into on lots of things later. They lived up there. They started rental cabins in the 20s and 30s. They did anything and everything to make a living, just like everybody. Still had a sawmill. The sawmill was still in operation when I was a little boy. And a lot of the old cabins in Kachera were built from lumber from that sawmill.
And Lloyd Powell did a lot of the rock work on different cabins, like Magruder's cabin and
Now, if you've ever been
those
in
down in
Magruder's
there
cabin,
around
it's a good example. His
by the store, those old cabins. He did a lot of the rock work on those in that area.
And then my grandparents bought out Kachera from Mays in 1936.
32.
32, excuse me. And my parents bought Kachera from my grandparents in 36. So that's kind of how we had, they only had it 9 years. Sold it to John Albright, 45. Bought out my grandparents at Yellow Pond. I lived there the rest of my life till 36 years ago. I was batching, had to find me a cook, so I found Shirley down east of Walsenburg one day, out in the middle of nowhere. But anyhow, Shirley and I lived at the Yellow Pond 18 years. And that's where Ronnie and her daughter were little kids, was at the Yellow Pond. Bruce knows that. He remembers that.
Yeah.
Set that. You got something to say?
No?
All right, set it off for
He
me.
just-
He carried the mail for
But you-
years.
But for him to remember her
Uh-huh.
and think about her all that
Oh,
time, he
that time.
probably,
He must have thought something was
yeah,
wrong.
he's-
Yeah.
because he wouldn't have sent her any precious hard-earned dollars if he had.
Yeah, that's the, well, we were down at Boy City, several years ago, and we found their old homestead, her parents' homestead. Now, that's a whole other story. Her dad must have been something. And he'd go off on a walk somewhere and not come back for 3 or 4 years. And he was always leaving them someplace while he went off to do something else.
Well, you know, Daniel Boone and Davy what was it? Davy Crockett would do
Real
that.
bad,
And
yeah.
he'd walk all the way to Florida
Yeah, just
and come back.
this old guy.
Now you can go.
Charlie Mack owned the south half of the Yellow Pine Ranch when my grandparents bought him out there. His dad, Charlie Mack's dad, owned where the Peterson place is across the road here, or what's his name?
McWillis.
McWillis's live now. That was the old man Mack, and Charlie Mack had where the Kachera Valley Ranch is.
When Charlie Mack sold the place over there to Peterson, he sold it for, what was it, $1,400, I think, and a wood stove
And
and
a team
a
of horses.
team of horses. We've got the title stuff on that.
Oh, that recalls another one I was going to tell about. Yeah, they can go in here, because you guys will sort it out. So, my folks sold Kachera to John Albright. They owned the store, the dance hall that my granddad and dad had built, which later was the Kachera Lodge that burned down several years ago. But they owned everything except the 75 private-owned cabins to John Albright for $15,000 and got top money. Them to death.
Yeah.
When you were there, you were on call 24 hours a day, all summer long.
Yeah.
And very little profit, very little profit. And they were glad to get out.
One year, I guess that was when your brother and sister were little kids. They had $150 for all winter.
Wow. Wow. Did they have gardens? Did they
Oh,
put
a
up
big garden, and
vegetables
they,
and honey?
yeah, they did that, and
But
they
still.
sold the vegetables, and they had milk cows, and sold cream and
Are you
all
recording
that stuff.
Go ahead,
That's
stand
all right.
right in there, girl.
That's all right. It helps for you to ask questions.
Conversation working.
And I'm gonna,
One winter, my dad was working for my granddad, cutting timber. They had a timber claim up Bennett Creek and cut timber in the wintertime for that sawmill. But granddad was paying his help $1 a day plus room and board. Dad got the $1 a day, but he didn't get the room and board, and he was a little upset. But you get to think about it. Pals had bought Kachera for my folks, and they were living there. They were getting room and board. But I guess it was a tough, hard winter for what days they could work cutting timber.
Hang on, hey,
all right,
hold your
go.
thought.
We got it.
But Mont Lumpkin was an old prospector that came from over at Placer, Russell Mount, over here, and found a nugget up to the south of the ski area. That he sold that, found a 100-pound rock, and he sold it for $300. He moved over here and lived with my grandparents for 2 years, prospecting that area by the ski area, but never found the source of where that gold came from. And he and Neil Basinger, my mother's cousin, were trapping in Wyoming. This must have been in the
I think the late 20s or 30s.
late 20s
Early
or 30s.
30s.
And coming home, they had a car wreck. Neil ran into a bridge for some reason and killed Mont Lumpkin. I've still got his rifle. My granddad, if at that time it was a fairly new Winchester Model 94, and we've still got it. Granddad gave it to me. And just some of that stuff. I'm sure Granddad got it because it was left there in the house when Mont was buried.
Got killed.
No place to go with it.
Ronnie thinks he's found the red ledge of rock up there that piece of
Gold came
gold
from.
in it came from. It's a piece of volcanic, one of their walls.
But there's just all kinds of stories about individuals around the color places you were talking about with the haunted house. Color was involved in stuff in Levita a bunch.
He was a barber and there was a thing in the paper not too long ago about him making the best ice cream around.
And they built that monstrosity building. No, it really wasn't that big. There was 3 rooms up top and 3 rooms on the first floor. But that never had any floors put in at the time. It was willow sticks nailed on the big logs and plastered with red mud. That's why the kids at that time loved it as the haunted house. It was a spooky looking old place, especially at night. And some kid from Texas, you could sure have fun with them. And they could run back down off of that mountain at night. That used to be the kind of thing, any new kid come to Kachera. Some of us would go up early and get things decorated for a spook show. And then somebody else would bring them up just at dark. And get ready for a fast trip back down the mountain. Starting in that area with the color place brings to mind that when I was a little boy, I helped the Kasai boys move cattle from over south of there through the color place and up and around through Bennett Park into the Trinchera Ranch. At that time at the Trinchera Ranch was still the big long aspen piles from where they cut aspen wood for the Excelsior mill that was on the Trinchera Ranch, just the other side of the top of the railroad Levita Pass. They made Excelsior. That was the packing that they had done. Now it's peanuts, foam peanuts, but Excelsior was the packing. But anyhow, when we came back that evening, one of the, either Armour or Bruno one said, let's take the old Indian Trail and go back down, go home. Southeast of Burnett Park, someplace, there is a trail that bails off the side of the mountain down to where the old road up Hudson Creek crosses the creek, and that's where it comes out, is right down by where the road crosses the creek in the bottom. When you get up to the old ski area on Cachera Pass or Fishpaw Pass or Cartland Pass or whatever you want to call it, you can look across there to Burnett Park and see why that trail came down off the hill there. And it was probably part of the reason the Forest Service called the trail that A.C. Arnold built the Indian Trail, because that was a natural Indian trail out of the San Luis Valley into the Cachera Valley. Someday when you're up there, you look across there and you can see where that trail came down a kind of a ridge in a valley, and I couldn't ever find the actual trail, and now it'd be even harder, but I'm sure there's still evidence of it on that hillside someplace. Okay, so
At one time, that they used.
In Georgia,
we're talking about Charlie Mack earlier. The interesting, or one of the interesting parts about Charlie Mack is they came out of Georgia. When Simpson made his march across Georgia, they ruined the
Sherman.
Mack. Sherman made the march across. They ruined the Mack family. But the Mack family came across southern Texas to El Paso, and then up the Rio Grande and came into this area to settle. That was something totally different than most of the people that came here. And they had what they could pack in a wagon, you know. But Charlie Mack was one of the really interesting old characters everybody loved. We've got a picture of him at Chaparral Falls. And they lived at the Cachera Valley Ranch. And he had a pet bear for a while.
And some deer, pet deer.
Pet deer. And they apparently were quite a family. And they moved from here to Western Slope.
They went to California when they were.
Oh, California.
Yeah, in
It
the,
was-
like the
It was
30s,
Arnold's
I
that
guess.
moved to the Western Slope.
Yeah, and then Arnold's moved back here. The Arnold family, all that stuff is really interesting too.
Can we go from here right into A.C. Arnold? A.C. Arnold was the great-granddad of the Arnolds that are now getting to be old folks in Levita, Darrell and whatnot. But A.C., when I was a little kid, and I was telling you earlier, we went to eat Sunday dinner with him, and his specialty was wild blueberry muffins, which were great. But about once every month or two, he would get in his old Dodge touring car and come to see Albert and Wanda Jameson. He smoked pot. He used kitchen matches to light his pipe. And I was a little kid watching him to see when he's going to burn his fingers. Because he'd fill that pipe and light a match, and he's worse than me about visiting. He kept visiting, that match would burn closer, and usually have to shake the dang thing out and get another one. Maybe he would get his pipe lit, And if he did, he took a couple puffs off it and forgot it. He smoked up more matches than any living human being I know of. But he loved that place up Chaparral Canyon. That was his home. As I said earlier, he apparently bought it from John W. Powell, because that's what the homestead shows, that John Powell homesteaded that. And AC in the Second World War was getting to be an old man, and I don't know how much of this the family would appreciate, but they moved him to Levita. The old man shouldn't be living up there in that canyon by himself. And every time they turned their back, he'd figure out how to get that old car started and go back to the cabin. This went on till he got so despondent that he shot himself. And what a shame. He was a great old man.
And his tombstone down at Levita is one of those great big black rocks that came from up in there, I guess.
Oh,
Okay. Another one that involves A.C. Arnold was how Bear Lake got its name. A.C. Arnold was trapped a bear at Bear Lake and had a skid pole tied to the trap, like usually they did. But this old bear drug that trap and that pole off in the lake. And AC was up there trying to get the bear out of the lake. When the Hill boys, the Hills had the cabin, the old log cabin just above Kachura. Then Nancy Christopherson said it was A.C. Arnold's. No, it was Hill's cabin, the old Kasai cabin, as you know it.
okay.
Okay, and they saw AC having trouble down at Bear Lake. And they came down off the mountain and helped AC get his bear out. And that's the story that Frank Arnold told us, is how Bear Lake got its name. But AC Arnold and George Drury, another old-time Levita person, took in pasture cattle in the late 1890s and early 1900s when it was free grazing still up in the Blue Lake area. They'd pasture anybody's cattle that wanted, they'd take care of and salt them and keep them up there. So that's why A.C. Arnold had probably was trapping bear because they were probably bothering his cattle or something.
That was the story that there was the bear killing cows.
Yeah, oh, that's right.
All right.
In the old Colorado statutes, water law statutes, they stated that you could irrigate high mountain meadows without a water right. Even to the point when I was a little boy, the water commissioner never came above the gap in the wall. So any meadows up above there could legally irrigate. Now the only legal ditch I know of was one Bushmill built from Dodgen Creek to over to irrigate the upper meadow there at the Yellow Pine. But that's why you saw those old ditches, because it was legal for them to irrigate. All of the Kasai place was irrigated. Becker Creek was irrigated. Now that's where A.C. Arnold lived. The first that I know of is in the old cabin there at Becker Creek. It's still part of it there.
Mm-hmm.
That's where A.C. Arnold and his first wife lived. From story, I guess it was either from my granddad or Frank Arnold, I don't know which. And then, I don't know where all A.C. lived after that. But they moved to Western Slope for a while. Some places is a picture.
Yeah, it's on the internet, and
Of the-
I've got a copy of it.
Arnold's
Their
had all
wagon
their
and their-
wagons loaded with everything. They all going to the Western Slope over there a few years, and then they come back to Levita.
If you look at that I think it's the Orfano County Genealogical site. There's quite a bit of stuff, of old pictures and really interesting stuff on it.
Okay.
The Urbans, the old folks, he was a jeweler and they were French people. They had a homestead back in behind where Mars Combs lives, and back over there by the, where that hole in that rock on Gimmer's Ranch back there is, maybe you've seen it, I don't know, big hole in the wall.
Okay.
But that was where the Urbans lived. And when I was a little kid, I remember going to, the old folks Urban had died, and it was a brother and sister that lived there. Jim and what's her name? Sarah lived in this old house over there. And the first time I was there was about 10 o'clock at night one night. Folks were trying to put up some grain and broke a bull wheel on their old binder. And they went over there to see if Jim might have one. And as I remember, we went through 9 different gates to get there. All the little fields and pastures were fenced out. Jim was one of these guys that would work all night long. He wouldn't get started very early in the morning. And that night, I remember he was just getting his cows into milk. It was after 10 o'clock. He said, and he always kind of meowed like a cat. He said, yeah, we do those chores pretty regular around here. About 11 in the morning, and about 11 at night. And that's one of the things. And I remember him driving an old Chevrolet, old 26 or 7 pickup, and he always had the hand crank. And he says, well, it starts pretty good, but I never did get that there self-starter to work. I was up at the Bradley place as a kid when he was telling that. I remember the location some of these things happened. And I remember him mowing hay down here along the highway in the dark with a lantern hanging out on the end of the sickle bar. He worked more at night than he did in the daytime. And the house, the next time I was in that house, was taking groceries to them one day.
That was down at Charlie's.
No, it was a
Oh,
tall
it was
house
an
over
old
there.
house, oh, okay.
That house was stacked totally full of magazines and cereal boxes. There was one spot on the table no bigger than just for a plate, and that was where Jim sat. Sarah would feed him there. The rest of it stacked to the ceiling. There was an old kerosene lamp burning up there in the corner. Chimney was just smoked. It was just a little orange glow. It was all I could see when I walked from outside in there to take groceries in for Sarah. Yeah,
Yeah.
at that time that my family came here, everything was homesteaded except isolated parcels, like the cabin up Chaparral and the up above or up Spring Creek, that what's their names? Now the car agency owns,
Oh, Spradley?
Spradley owns now up there. I always heard that that was Frank Powell Homestead, which was another brother of my granddad's. But apparently he didn't prove up on it because the records don't show that he did. But I heard it was Frank Powell Homestead.
You can get a lot of this homestead stuff from the BLM site of when they filed on them and when they proved up on them. Most of it was 5 years to prove up on it. They had to build a cabin that had a door and a window.
And that was proven up on it?
And Dick's granddad, Pine Haven,
Homestead Pine Haven.
he homesteaded that And we don't think he probably stayed there very many nights. He was supposed to stay there at night, but he had a good house up above, just about a mile.
He was a Civil War veteran,
Yeah,
and being a Civil War veteran, he only had to live on it
yeah.
3 months out of the year or something like that. There
And it was
an
a,
old
a
shack.
timber claim, wasn't it?
No, the timber claim was just because you bought, yeah, you got it because you used the timber.
Yeah.
But the old Powell homestead on Pine Haven was down below Bob's house in that little meadow down there. And I just remember part of it, shack there. But you know, half a mile up the road was a warm bed, a good cook. I don't imagine he spent very many nights down there. He was a Civil War veteran that carried a ball in his leg and he got shot in the hand during the Civil War.
Wow.
That's all we,
And he used to get like $2 for his pension.
that was my great granddad, John L. Powell. And that's in that book. You'll get a lot of stuff out of that. I didn't realize you guys hadn't seen that,
Uh-uh.
that book.
All right.
Oh,
Well, sorry to interrupt what you did.
okay. My dad bought him at the sale in La Junta when he was about 2 weeks old, and we fed him on a bottle. And he always thought he was a human. He was never a burra, according to him. It was just, and he was a troublemaker.
He could open every gate on the ranch easily. If it was a wire gate with the loops, you had to put an extra wire and wire the two loops together to keep him from slipping one, either the top one up or the bottom one down. He'd paw at the bottom one until he kicked it clear off. He opened, well, one winter I was calving out a bunch of heifers in the barn at the Yellow Pine and checking them every 2 hours. And I'd go out the barn, and Kecklebird be in the barn. I knew he could get in there. He'd open a little corral gate we had, and open the barn door. So one night there was a heifer coming close to having a calf, and I decided I'd shut the lights off and just wait over there in the dark for a while. I heard that gate on the corral gate, or the latch on the corral gate rattling. And he opened it. Then the barn door latch was rattling. He opened it. He had to jump up a ways to get in. And he jumped up in the barn, and the first thing I saw was his nose on the light switch. He got where he'd jump in and turn the lights on so he could see. And I couldn't figure out why the lights kept being turned on in that barn until I saw him turn them on.
And he could turn the faucets on for the irrigation hose in the yard. He never would turn it back on, and I don't know how many times people had come down from the cabins, we're out of water again. And he turned it on and left the hose running. And he sides and
He did a sprinkler be running there where Joanne and Van Lou lives. My mom lived over there. He'd stick his mouth over a sprinkler and drink and drink and drink till his belly was too big and heavy he could hardly walk. You know?
one day Gene Stewart had his art class set up in the lane up there with probably 8-10 ladies and their hats and all that stuff. He was had an art class going, and I'd been watching Cuckelburr, and he was across the highway there behind the mailbox, and I knew he was gonna join the art class if he could figure out how to do it. Well, he did, and you should have seen Gene hurry to help me get him back in. And another time, there was a Forest Service guy, and he'd come down the road from Burnett Park in his pickup, and he walked down the house to find out how to get out of, because that gate was, I guess
That
that
was
one
locked.
gate was locked, and I told him just go back up and go across the creek and come out the other gate. Well, it was probably an hour or so, and I noticed that the guy was still up there. and I went to see what was wrong. He couldn't get out and keep Cuckleberry in at the same time. And
Well,
then we had a soil conservation guy that was he was always kind of poking around where he didn't need to be. One day I
kind of
looked out
wimpy.
and here he came sailing over the yard fence, or the fence out by the pasture, and Cuckleberry right after him.
if somebody would run,
He
he'd
would-
get 'em.
Yeah.
Uh,
The
he
only-
loved to chase motorcycles. Anybody up in the pasture with a motorcycle, there's trail bikes and stuff, Cuckle was right after it. One day I rode one up there, made a circle, and here, little old Cuckle chased me down off the hill, and then I brought it to a sudden stop. And yelled at him. He just wilted. Oh, it's you. Flirt Humphreys was her name, wasn't it?
Yeah.
That he left teeth marks on her rear one day because she thought he had his hoof caught in the fence, and she bent over to help him get out, and he bit her on her rear. Now, how did she explain that to her husband? That's size teeth marks.
The only time we ever saw him come home by himself, Lynn and Carol were living and they fed him a jalapeno pepper, and he came home by himself without. And most of the time, somebody had to lead him. My dad had put a rope around his neck and bring him home with the pickup just as fast as he could go. He'd skid his feet for a while, and then his feet would get hot, and he'd come pick them up and come home.
He got where you could lead him with a rope out the window, and he'd never tighten it. He loped just as hard as he could to stay up with that pickup, keep from getting hot feet. But he opened every gate. He wouldn't go through a fence. We put him in the corral up at Mason's one day, and with a slide bolt latch. Audrey timed him 10 minutes, and he figured that latch out. The one at the barn I was talking about later, I found a latch that had a tongue and an extra piece that swung underneath. It took him 2 years to master that one, but he did. He got where he could hold that bottom piece with his tongue and flip the other part out. He was smart. And then they let him get kicked by a horse.
Well, when we moved away from Yellow Pine, Scarberry was giving us a little bit of trouble, and so we decided he deserved to have Cuckleberry. We left him.
Left him for Scarberry. And he did what we wanted.
He gave him trouble several. They moved here in the fall of '61, and we're gonna put. They had dude horses down at Taos, New Mexico, and we're gonna put them at south of Pueblo, and that didn't work out. And the next summer they had them at Lathrop Park, and that didn't work out either. I think they rented just a little bit.
They took in $90 for the
$90.
summer.
Because they were
At the
fishing
park.
there and not riding dude horses, and the people wouldn't let their kids ride them. So that next fall they moved them to Cachera, and they got the caretaker's job and lived in the caretaker's house for the longest time that anybody was ever caretakers at Cachera, I guess. What was it, 16 years or something like that. And they had their dude horses up in the above the park for 25 years.
Earl Mason had a personality that nobody else could have ever lived that long with it. One day I went up to help Earl get a whole bunch of dudes started out. He said, if I get them going, then I've got it made. Well, he had a little boy on a Shetland behind him after they got up across the creek and moving up, and the little boy was bawling, and Mama was behind, yap, 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 yap. Nobody else could do this. But Earl said, lady, you get your ass to the back of the line and you keep it there. I don't wanna see you till we're done.
I'll
She
take care
puffed-
of this kid.
She puffed up like a horned toad, but she went. And Earl left with a little boy right behind. When they came back to the grill, everybody was laughing and joking, and Mama and little boy was extremely happy, and Mama was happy too. Just worked good. Earl said, I had to get her out of there to get that boy to pay attention to what I was telling him. And after they got up on the mountain and visited, there was no more problem. If I'd said that to somebody else, I'd been in big trouble.
I don't know how many pictures there is of his hand on some lady's
Rear.
wide hind end, pushing her up on the horse.
One day, Lowell Gimmer and Bob Hasnick and I were going up to Burnett Park to fix fence. Got up by the old ski area there on the Yellow Pine. Just as Earl come down across the creek with his bunch of dudes to go up there. This one guy was riding a big old yellow horse Earl had, and when the horse jumped the creek, this guy jabbed him, was going up there to go fishing, and he jabbed that old yellow horse in the shoulder with a fishing pole. We got there just in time to see this guy go flying, land on his back in the middle of the road out there. It was soft dirt, didn't hurt him. Earl was still gathering him up when Lowell Gimmer and I went up the mountain. And Lowell Gimmer with these fancy horses and me with a ranch horse that didn't get used as much. Sweat was running out of them by the time we got to that park. Those Gimmer horses were plumb white between the hind legs. They were sweating so much. By the time we got to Burnett Park, Earl Mason and his dudes were trying to pass us. And they were just riding old dude horses. But those horses climbed that mountain every day. They were tough. They were tough.
They worked at the ranch in the wintertime when they weren't being dude
Yeah.
horses.
If I went up to borrow a horse, I'd have to spank him to break the pattern that they rode every day. But once you broke the pattern, it was just a ranch horse that you rode all the time. No problem. Oh, you could go on talking about Earl Mason. It's
Now, is that your dad?
Yeah.
All right.
And I can't think of his name. I get the blind guy.
Oh, yeah. Dave Torbett.
Dave Torbett. I used to take Dave Torbett, just him and I. Or if he wanted to ride, Earl had told me, and I'd come up and take Dave. He had been in this country before he got into an accident with a shotgun and lost his eyesight. And he was more fun to take. He'd be riding along in a tree limb in the lane. If it was soft, don't tell him about it. And he told me that. If it's soft and won't hurt me, don't tell me. If it's stiff, tell me what to do. And if you'd say, Dad, you better get over a couple foot to the left, he could take a horse and just set him over. And the horses always seemed like they knew that Dave was that way. They just took care of him, you know. And he said, now, the Spanish Peaks is over there, Trincheras over there. When you get up on an open hillside with the sun shining and stuff, and he knew he was out in the open, he was quite a man. And his son was on this little small brat several.
You probably remember him.
And all that wood was cut in 10-foot long lengths, as I remember. And the pile was a couple 100 feet long, maybe 10 feet high. And the Trinchera Ranch had a railroad of their own that came from the top of Avita Pass up into McCarty Park to get that aspen lumber for their sawmill, for their Excelsior mill. Did you guys ever see Excelsior? It was shredded aspen wood into real fine shreds. It'd puff up There was one in Levita for years and years and years, in a Seltzer mill,
What was it used for?
packing,
Packing.
Oh. Oh.
before foam.
And like when they used to cut ice, and the blocks of ice, they'd put Excelsior and sawdust between it to keep it. That was another thing they did at Cachera was the ponds at Yellow Pine. They cut ice in blocks to have, and the ice house was behind the store.
A log building behind the store, you probably remember that little log building. Put ice in there and then cover it up with sawdust. And it'd last, there's usually some ice still in August that they sold through the store and delivered to people's cabins, because that was before electricity. So ice boxes. Levita had a big deal of, one of them was 50 carloads of ice they shipped out at one time from Levita. Lake George up above Colorado Springs, that lake was built for ice harvest for the railroad. The saws for the ice skating at Couture are hanging and running in Cindy's house, where you stood up and run the saw this way, sawing blocks of ice. They tried to wait till the ice got froze about 2 foot thick, so they could cut a 2 by 2 by 2 foot block out.
And there was
Say that one again.
that when Dick's grandparents came, and we didn't tell you how they got here. They were living down in eastern Colorado, and they had their son, and Wanda was 7 months old when they came. They were headed for Farmington, New Mexico, and they found out that the place up there was for sale, so they stayed and bought it. There seemed to be a lot of people that were headed for Farmington when they came through this country and stayed. Don't know why. But anyway, now where was I?
They came in a covered
In
wagon.
a covered wagon over Cachera Pass. Came up the river from Trinidad, over the mesa east of Trinidad, and up the river and over Cachera Pass. And, yeah, to Cachera.
That route was very popular for quite a few of them because it had water. You know, you working team horses, you had to have water pretty regular. And Mom used to tell stories about coming down that old pass road that crossed over the wall right east of the Spanish Peaks Inn. You've been on that whole trail. Came over the old pass, you know, crossed over up by where the old Vernon house is up there, and come down and over the wall. But anyhow, she talked about coming down through there at night, following a team of shod horses, and all that petrified wood would spark under the hooves at night coming down through there. That was the whole road that most of it was on the east side of the creek. Came down. We could go into stuff through that old wagon road down through there. The people that lived.
She would have been older than
And then,
when
yeah.
they came.
But
But they raised all vegetables and milk cows and had chickens and eggs, and Grandma Powell used to rent horses. She also had fish. She would feed cottage cheese to her fish. And one time after we took the cabins over, somebody came by and wanted that cabin that rented for $2.50 a night. Well, that was a long time ago. Now they charge about $200 a night for that one that we rented for $50 a night or something.
you know, another interesting thing that happened in this country was the old timers on those homesteads up on Fishpaw Pass Road. The story's always been out that they made their living raising potatoes. Well, they did that. They also milked cows and made cheese. But I later found out one of the biggest things they did, that all that old dead timber that had burned in that fire, that 1834 fire, they were cutting it for mine prop timber in the coal mines down by Trinidad. And that was probably their main source of income, was the mine props. And then later, there was a guy in Levita by the name of Joe Ferrari that had a crew that had first cabins were up in Bend Creek above Pine Haven. That was the first place they lived. Then later they built some more cabins over in Bennett Creek, up above the old ski area. And they harvested lodgepole pine, and over there they went all the way to Bennett Park and all these mine props out. I went to school at the schoolhouse at the Yellow Pine when I was a little kid. Went there for 6 years. My mother was, 7 years. My mother was teacher for 6, and 7th grade teacher. Got bad and quit early, so that's just 5 months. We only had 7 months school. That year I had 5. But anyhow, they haul those lodge poles out down close to the highway, and then old Joe Ferrari would bring this old Ford truck he had and stack poles on that thing till that truck shouldn't have carried anything. One load got spilled at the gap in the wall when he came around there. The load was too heavy and scattered poles that rolled down through there a long ways. And another time down there by the hole in the rock going to Walsenburg, where they've got that grotto up there, he spilled a load down there that went from the highway almost to the creek down there. And then later, they made that road up Dodgen Creek and had that camp up there, the last one. And I went, as I said, I went to school there with some of those kids. They were mostly Hispanic, or all Hispanic kids that I went to school with. I remember walking down that muddy road for half a mile there in the morning to get to the schoolhouse. No overshoes, wet, muddy feet. Teacher, I got too much cold in my feet. And they'd get up to that old pot-bellied stove and try to get warm.
What do you know about the 1834 fire?
My knowledge there came from A.C. Arnold. A.C. Arnold said he was talking to an old trapper that had come through this country in 1834, and it had just burned. And this whole darn country burned.
There's a lot of the pine trees around with a burn scar on the north side.
One of them's in the deck of the dog barn.
Yeah.
The one that the deck's built around,
Uh-huh.
if you look, get where you can see down under the deck, there's a scar on that old tree. There's one at the Lazy Day cabin at Yellow Pine. That brings on another story. And the wind came up real bad one night. My granddad had his thrashing machine parked under on the north side of that tree. The wind blowing down the canyon like it does. He got up, caught his team, went and hooked onto that thrash machine, moved it. Well, it wasn't too many years till the team were old and dead. The thrashing machine, a lot of it was built out of wood. It rotted down to nothing. Then the old man died. And you know that tree's still there.
That would be a great way to stop. that was a barn.
I was 6 years old. And, you know, always went to milk with the guys.
Yeah.
And this old cow had just had a calf. And some reason or other, she got mad at me and got me down by the barn and tore my right ear till it was hanging down
Who sewed it back up?
on my face and broke my collarbone.
Old
Wow.
doctor in Walsenburg.
Oh,
And there's some folks by the name of Purefoy that later had a cabin in Kitchener
I recognize that name.
that had a brand new Buick car. And I guess I probably got blood all over that brand new car, even though I was wrapped up in towels and stuff.
yeah, I bet. Something on your head bleeds
Yeah,
like
bleeds
crazy.
And I guess it was Julian Tracy.
I don't know.
No, it was a guy from Walsenburg that kept working for
Feeney,
Dad.
Pete Feeney.
Pete Feeney that carried me to the house. And the old man Lemmy, not Bud Lemmy, but his dad, the one that was involved in the 1899 in deal in,
Okay.
in that Lemmy Hospital,
Okay.
but they had moved to Walsenburg. He sewed this ear back on my head. Until I was grown up, and that old man was still being almost a retired doctor. I'd walk in and he'd reach over and grab me and say, "That thing's still on, isn't it?"
Did a good job.
Did a good job.
Oh.